At the wedding, everyone froze as the bride's father suddenly stood up. The guests expected a heartfelt speech, but instead, he declared, "I am against this marriage." Alyssa turned pale, her fiancé tightened his grip on her hand, and a tense silence filled the room. No one could believe that millionaire Richard Carter had chosen to make such a statement right before the altar. But the most shocking part wasn't what he said, it was the reason why he was so desperately trying to stop the wedding. Alyssa Carter had spent her entire life living under the shadow of her father's expectations. As the only daughter of Richard Carter, a billionaire and one of the most influential businessmen in the country, she was raised to believe that her future was already mapped out for her. She had attended the finest schools, had been introduced to the most powerful families, and had been subtly guided toward a life of privilege and status. But none of that mattered when she met James Williams. It happened in the most unexpected way. She had been attending a charity event hosted by one of her father's business associates, a glamorous affair filled with socialites, investors, and politicians. Alyssa had never been particularly fond of these gatherings, but she knew her presence was expected. As she wandered through the elegantly decorated hall, her attention was drawn to a quiet conversation happening near the corner of the room. A man stood there, speaking with a group of doctors about a new medical initiative aimed at providing affordable healthcare for low-income families. He wasn't dressed in the sharp tuxedos that the other men wore. Instead, he had on a tailored navy blue suit, looking both refined and effortlessly confident. Alyssa could see the passion in his eyes as he spoke, his deep voice filled with conviction. Curious, she moved closer, listening as he explained how he had grown up in a struggling community, how he had worked his way through medical school, and how he now dedicated his life to saving others. There was something undeniably magnetic about him, his intelligence, his warmth, the way he spoke about his work as if it was more than just a career, but a calling. When their eyes finally met, something shifted in her. He gave her a polite but curious smile, as if he recognized her but wasn't sure where from. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere but here," he said, amusement in his voice. Alyssa raised an eyebrow. "And you don't?" James chuckled. "I'm here because I believe in what we're trying to accomplish." "You?" She sighed, glancing around the room. "Because my father expects me to be." He studied her for a moment, then extended his hand. "I'm James Williams." "And you are?" "Alyssa Carter," she said, shaking his hand. Something flickered across his face, but it wasn't the usual recognition she was used to. It wasn't the look of someone impressed by her last name. It was something else, curiosity, maybe even understanding. "You're Richard Carter's daughter," he said, but there was no judgment in his voice. "And you're not impressed," she noted, slightly amused. James shrugged. "I don't judge people by their last names." For the first time in a long time, Alyssa felt genuinely seen. They spent the rest of the evening talking, slipping away from the crowded ballroom and finding a quieter space near the terrace. Their conversation flowed easily, as if they had known each other forever. She told him about her life, about how she sometimes felt trapped by the expectations placed on her. He told her about his journey, about the struggles he had faced growing up, about the countless nights he had spent studying while working multiple jobs just to make it through school. By the end of the night, Alyssa knew one thing for certain: she wanted to see him again. James, however, hesitated. "Are you sure you want to get involved with someone like me?" Alyssa frowned. "What do you mean?" He exhaled, glancing at the elegant crowd inside. "You come from a different world. Your father, he's not going to approve." Alyssa squared her shoulders. "My father doesn't get to decide who I care about." James studied her for a moment before a slow smile spread across his lips. "Then I'd like to see where this goes." And so, it began. For months, they kept their relationship private, meeting in places where they wouldn't be recognized, stealing moments together in between their busy lives. Alyssa had never felt this way about anyone before. James wasn't like the men her father had introduced her to. He didn't care about wealth or status, and he certainly didn't treat her like a prize to be won. But the secrecy couldn't last forever. One evening, after yet another charity gala where she had been forced to smile and engage in polite but meaningless conversation, she had enough. She drove straight to her father's estate, where he was sitting in his study, going over business reports. "We need to talk," she said firmly, stepping into the room. Richard barely glanced up from his papers. "What about?" Alyssa took a deep breath. "I'm seeing someone, and I want you to meet him." Her father finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Who is he?" She lifted her chin. "James Williams. He's a surgeon. And I love him." A heavy silence filled the room. Richard's expression darkened. "No." Alyssa's stomach twisted. "Excuse me?" Richard set his papers down, folding his hands together. "You can't be serious. You are not bringing someone like that into this family." Her hands clenched into fists. "Someone like that? You haven't even met him." "I don't need to," Richard said coldly. "He's not from our world. He doesn't belong." Alyssa felt anger rise in her chest. "You don't even know him, and you're already judging him? Is this about his background, or is this about the fact that he's black?" Richard's jaw tightened. "It's about the fact that he will never understand the kind of life you were meant to have." Alyssa's heart pounded. "The life I was meant to have? Or the life you want for me?" Her father's silence was all the answer she needed. She took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with determination. "I love him. And whether you accept it or not, I'm going to marry him." Richard's expression hardened. "If you go through with this, Alyssa, you'll be making the biggest mistake of your life." She lifted her chin, meeting his cold gaze without fear. "No, Dad," she said. "For the first time, I'm making the right choice." And with that, she walked out of the room, her heart pounding, knowing that her battle had only just begun. Alyssa had expected resistance from her father, but she hadn't anticipated just how deep his disapproval would run. The morning after their conversation, she woke up to a flurry of missed calls from her mother, Sarah. Her father had wasted no time in expressing his displeasure, and Alyssa knew that whatever was coming next, it wouldn't be easy. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone before finally calling her mother back. "Alyssa," Sarah answered immediately, her voice laced with concern. "Your father told me what happened last night. Are you sure about this?" Alyssa took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Yes, Mom. I love James. I'm not changing my mind." Sarah sighed on the other end of the line. "Your father is furious. He thinks you're making a mistake." Alyssa clenched her jaw. "Of course, he does. Because he refuses to see James for who he really is." There was a pause before her mother spoke again, her tone softer. "He's stubborn, Alyssa. But he loves you. He just wants what's best for you." Alyssa closed her eyes, fighting back frustration. "James is what's best for me. And if Dad can't see that, then that's his problem, not mine." "I just don't want this to drive a wedge between you two," Sarah said gently. Alyssa knew her mother meant well, but she also knew that this wasn't just about a disagreement, it was about her father's inability to let go of his outdated views. She wasn't willing to compromise her happiness to protect his ego. "I need to go, Mom," Alyssa said, her voice firm. "I'll talk to you later." After hanging up, she sat in silence for a moment before grabbing her keys. She needed to see James. When she arrived at his apartment, he opened the door with a cautious expression, as if he already knew what had happened. "You talked to him," James said, stepping aside to let her in. Alyssa nodded, walking past him into the living room. "It went exactly how I expected." James exhaled, running a hand over his face. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said quickly, turning to face him. "This isn't about you. It's about him and his refusal to accept that I have the right to choose who I love." James studied her carefully. "You know this isn't going to be easy, right?" Alyssa let out a humorless laugh. Nothing in my life has ever been easy. James walked toward her, his expression unreadable. I just don't want you to regret this. She looked up at him, her heart aching at the thought that he still wasn't sure where she stood. She reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. I could never regret choosing you, she whispered. James swallowed hard, his gaze locked on hers. Then we do this together. Alyssa nodded. Together. But deep down, she knew that her father wasn't going to back down without a fight. The days that followed were tense. Richard Carter had never been the type of man to lose a battle, and Alyssa quickly realized that he wasn't just going to accept her decision, he was going to try to change it. She found out from Sarah that Richard had started making calls to powerful friends, trying to dig up anything he could about James. Alyssa was disgusted but not surprised. Her father was a businessman, and to him, everything was about control. If he couldn't control her through reason, he would try to do it by force. James, of course, wasn't intimidated. One evening, as they sat together in his apartment, he looked at her with quiet determination. I won't let him scare me away, he said. But I need you to be sure, Alyssa. Because once we go through with this, there's no turning back. Alyssa met his gaze without hesitation. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. James exhaled, nodding. Then we moved forward. The moment Alyssa announced their engagement publicly, everything exploded. Her father refused to speak to her. Some of her so-called friends began to distance themselves, whispering behind her back about how she was throwing her future away. Even the media caught wind of the story, and suddenly, her relationship with James became a headline. But none of that mattered. Because for the first time in her life, Alyssa was making a choice for herself. And no one, not even Richard Carter, was going to take that away from her. Alyssa had always known that standing up to her father would be difficult, but she had underestimated just how far he was willing to go to keep control over her life. Ever since she publicly announced her engagement to James, the pressure from her family and the social circles she had grown up in had intensified. Overnight, she had gone from the admired daughter of a billionaire to the subject of hushed whispers and judgmental stares. It wasn't just the media that had latched onto the story, it was the people who had once claimed to be her friends, the business associates who had always treated her with respect, and even distant relatives who suddenly felt entitled to voice their opinions. But the worst of it came from her father. Richard Carter was not a man who accepted defeat easily. When persuasion and reason had failed, he had turned to something far more ruthless: manipulation. Alyssa had barely settled into her morning coffee when her mother called, her voice tinged with hesitation. Sweetheart, your father wants to see you. Alyssa sighed, already exhausted by the idea of another argument. Mom, I already know what he's going to say. It's not going to change anything. Sarah hesitated on the other end. He said it's important. Just hear him out. Alyssa closed her eyes, rubbing her temples. Part of her wanted to refuse outright, but she knew her mother was only trying to keep the peace. Fine, she said. I'll go. She knew better than to meet him at his office, where he had the advantage. Instead, she agreed to see him at the family estate, a place that once held warm childhood memories but now only felt like a battlefield. When she arrived, Richard was waiting for her in his study, seated behind his massive oak desk like a king on his throne. He didn't rise to greet her. He simply gestured for her to sit, his expression unreadable. Alyssa didn't bother with pleasantries. If this is another attempt to convince me to call off the wedding, you're wasting your time. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same calculating gaze he used when negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. I don't expect to change your mind, Alyssa. I simply want you to listen. She crossed her arms. I'm listening. He exhaled slowly, as if preparing himself for a long speech. I did some research on James. Alyssa's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. Of course, you did. I know he's a talented surgeon, Richard continued. I know he worked hard to get where he is. And I know that on paper, he seems like a respectable man. Alyssa narrowed her eyes. But? Her father's gaze hardened. But he will never fit into this world, Alyssa. He doesn't understand the responsibilities that come with being part of a family like ours. He wasn't raised in it. He doesn't know the sacrifices that have to be made to maintain this kind of life. Alyssa clenched her fists. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You're not worried about him being a good man. You're worried about him not being one of us. Richard didn't flinch. That matters. No, it doesn't, Alyssa shot back. You just want me to marry someone you can control. Someone who won't challenge you. But James is his own person. And so am I. Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. Alyssa, I built everything we have from the ground up. I didn't do that so you could throw it away for a man who doesn't even understand what it means to carry a legacy. Alyssa's anger flared. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing happiness. Something you've never understood. Her father's jaw tightened. Happiness is temporary. Security is forever. She stood up, shaking her head in disbelief. You don't get it. You never will. Before she could walk away, Richard spoke again. If you marry him, you're on your own. Alyssa froze. She turned back slowly, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, any indication that he didn't mean what he had just said. But there was none. His expression was cold, distant, unwavering. If you do this, he said calmly, you won't have my support. Financially, socially, or otherwise. You will not have a place in this family anymore. Alyssa's heart pounded, but she forced herself to keep her voice steady. You would really cut off your own daughter just because she refuses to be your puppet? Richard's eyes darkened. I'm protecting our name. A heavy silence filled the room. Alyssa took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. She had spent her whole life under her father's influence, molded into the perfect daughter, trained to follow the path he had laid out for her. But this was the moment she had to decide who she really was. She met his gaze, unflinching. Then I guess I don't need your name anymore. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the study, out of the estate, and out of the life that had once defined her. Her father had given her an ultimatum. And she had made her choice. Alyssa didn't cry. She had expected the conversation with her father to be difficult, but she hadn't expected him to go so far as to cut her off completely. Deep down, she had hoped that even if he didn't approve, he would still love her enough to stand by her. But Richard Carter was a man who valued control above all else, and if he couldn't control her, he would rather erase her from his life entirely. She drove back to her apartment in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her mind was racing, but there was no regret in her heart. She had made her choice, and she would live with the consequences. When she walked through the door, James was waiting for her. He stood from the couch the moment he saw her, concern etched into his face. What happened? He asked, stepping closer. Alyssa set her bag down and exhaled slowly. He gave me an ultimatum. Either I call off the wedding, or I lose everything. James's expression darkened. And you? She lifted her chin. I told him I didn't need his name anymore. For a moment, James just stared at her, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. Then he reached out and pulled her into his arms. Alyssa let herself sink into his embrace, feeling the tension in her body start to unravel. She had been bracing herself for this moment, for the loneliness that would come with walking away from the only life she had ever known. But in James's arms, she didn't feel alone. You didn't have to do that for me, he murmured. She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. I didn't do it for you. I did it for us. James cupped her face gently. I don't care about money, Alyssa. Or status. I just don't want you to wake up one day and regret this decision. She shook her head. The only thing I would regret is letting my father dictate my life. I love you, James. And if that means starting over, then so be it. James studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Then we'll start over together. The days that followed were filled with adjustments. Alyssa had never truly realized how much of her life had been shaped by her father's wealth until it was suddenly gone. She no longer had access to her family's accounts, her credit cards were cut off, and the invitations to elite events stopped arriving. She wasn't just ignored, she was erased. She had always had a safety net, a world that protected her from the struggles of everyday life. Now, for the first time, she was stepping into the unknown with nothing but her own determination. James insisted on covering expenses, but Alyssa refused to depend on him entirely. She started looking for work, wanting to prove to herself that she was capable of standing on her own. The problem was, most of the jobs she had been qualified for were in companies where her last name had once opened doors. Now, those same doors were slammed shut. One afternoon, she sat at the kitchen table, scanning job listings with a growing sense of frustration. James walked in, setting a cup of coffee in front of her. "Any luck?" Alyssa sighed. Turns out the job market isn't exactly welcoming to someone whose only real experience is being the daughter of a billionaire. James leaned against the counter, watching her. "You could take some time to figure things out. There's no rush." She shook her head. "I don't want to be dependent on you. I need to prove, to myself, to everyone, that I can do this." James nodded. "Then let's figure it out together." Alyssa eventually found a job at a small marketing firm. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't come with the perks she had once taken for granted, but it was hers. She worked long hours, determined to prove her worth not as Richard Carter's daughter, but as Alyssa, the woman who refused to be defined by her past. At night, she would come home exhausted, and James would be there, waiting with takeout and a warm smile. He never once made her feel like she had given up something irreplaceable. Instead, he made her feel like she had finally found something real. One evening, after another grueling day at work, Alyssa collapsed onto the couch with a tired groan. James sat beside her, handing her a glass of wine. "You survived another day in the real world," he teased. She smirked. "Barely." James chuckled, then grew serious. "I know this isn't easy. But I want you to know that I'm proud of you." Alyssa looked at him, warmth spreading through her chest. "I couldn't have done this without you." James reached for her hand. "You would have. Because you're stronger than you think." Alyssa squeezed his fingers, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Her father had tried to break her, to make her believe that she was nothing without his name, his fortune, his influence. But he had been wrong. She had lost a life of luxury. But she had gained something far greater. Love. Freedom. Herself. And for the first time, she knew she had made the right choice. Alyssa had expected to struggle, but she had underestimated just how difficult life without her father's influence would be. She had spent her whole life in a world where doors automatically opened for her, where people returned her calls without hesitation, and where opportunities were handed to her simply because of her last name. Now, she was just another applicant, another worker, another person trying to make a living without the cushion of generational wealth to catch her if she fell. Her job at the marketing firm was demanding. She was at the bottom of the ladder, assigned the most tedious tasks, sorting files, organizing schedules, proofreading reports that no one else wanted to read. She was used to being respected, listened to, given a seat at the table simply because of who her father was. Here, she was invisible. At first, it was frustrating. She wanted to prove herself, to show that she was capable of more, but no one cared about her ambitions. She was an entry-level employee, and that's how she was treated. She stayed late, came in early, and worked harder than she ever had before. James noticed her exhaustion. Every evening, she would come home drained, her enthusiasm slowly wearing down as the reality of her new life settled in. He never once said, "I told you so," but she could see the concern in his eyes. One night, As she sat at the kitchen table with a pile of reports she had brought home to review, James placed a hand on her shoulder. "You need a break," he said gently. Alyssa sighed, rubbing her temples. "I can't afford a break." James pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. "You're pushing yourself too hard. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." She let out a bitter laugh. "I do, though. If I fail, my father wins. He'll look at me and say, 'I told you so.' He'll think I couldn't make it without him." James studied her, his expression unreadable. "And if you succeed? What then?" Alyssa hesitated, caught off guard by the question. James leaned closer. "Are you doing this for yourself? Or are you still letting him control you?" She opened her mouth to argue but stopped. Was she really doing this for herself? Or was she just trying to prove a point? James reached for her hand, his touch grounding her. "You don't have to live your life trying to prove something to a man who never saw your worth in the first place." Alyssa swallowed hard, his words sinking in. She had spent her entire life trying to earn her father's approval, and even now, when she had walked away from him, she was still allowing his opinion to dictate her choices. She exhaled slowly, nodding. "You're right." James smiled. "I usually am." She rolled her eyes, but for the first time in weeks, she felt lighter. The next day at work, she approached her tasks with a new mindset. She stopped trying to impress people who weren't paying attention and started focusing on what actually mattered. Instead of just completing assignments, she paid attention to the bigger picture. She studied the marketing strategies, asked questions about the campaigns, and slowly began to understand the industry beyond just her entry-level role. Over time, her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Her supervisor, a woman named Diane, started giving her more responsibility. She was asked to sit in on meetings, take notes for executives, and eventually contribute ideas of her own. She was still far from where she wanted to be, but for the first time, she felt like she was earning her place, not because of her last name, but because of her work. One evening, she came home feeling exhausted but satisfied. James was cooking dinner, and the smell of garlic and roasted vegetables filled their small apartment. "You're in a good mood," he noted, setting 2 plates on the table. Alyssa smiled as she sat down. "I got my first real assignment today." Diane asked for my input on a client's rebranding strategy. James grinned. "That's amazing. I told you they'd see your potential." Alyssa picked up her fork, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the food. "For the first time, I feel like I'm doing something for myself. Not for my father. Not for anyone else. Just for me." James reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "That's all I ever wanted for you." Alyssa squeezed his fingers, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Her father had taken away everything he could, his financial support, his approval, even her place in the elite world she had once belonged to. But he hadn't taken away her ability to build something new. And for the first time, she realized she didn't need his validation. She had herself. And that was enough. Alyssa had always believed that once she stepped away from her father's influence, she would finally be free. But freedom came with its own struggles, and despite the progress she had made, the weight of everything she had lost still lingered in the back of her mind. Months had passed since she had walked away from the life she once knew, and while she had found stability in her job and comfort in her life with James, the ache of estrangement from her family was something she couldn't ignore. Her mother still called occasionally, always careful to avoid the topic of her father, but the conversations were strained, filled with unspoken words and forced pleasantries. One evening, after another long day at work, Alyssa sat on the couch, staring at the phone in her hand. James walked in, immediately noticing the tension in her posture. "You okay?" he asked, sitting beside her. Alyssa hesitated before sighing. "My mom called again today. She said my father's been asking about me." James studied her carefully. "And how do you feel about that?" She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know. Part of me is still so angry at him, but another part of me," she trailed off, struggling to find the right words. James nodded, as if he understood what she couldn't say. "You miss him." Alyssa swallowed hard. "I don't miss his control. I don't miss the way he tried to dictate my life. But he's still my father. And no matter how much I try to pretend otherwise, losing him still hurts." James took her hand in his grip warm and steady. "Do you think he regrets what he said to you?" Alyssa shook her head. "My father doesn't regret. He just waits for people to come crawling back to him." James tilted his head slightly. "And are you?" Alyssa frowned. "Of course not." "Then what do you want?" he asked gently. She sighed, leaning her head back against the couch. "I don't know. Maybe I just want him to see me for who I really am. Not as his daughter, not as someone he can control, but as a person who made a choice and didn't break because of it." James squeezed her hand. "Then maybe it's time he sees that." Alyssa glanced at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "You think I should talk to him?" James shrugged. "I think if it's something that's weighing on you, you should face it. Not for him, but for you." Alyssa was quiet for a long time, contemplating his words. Maybe James was right. Maybe this wasn't about reconciliation or proving a point. Maybe it was about finally closing a chapter that had been left unfinished. 2 days later, Alyssa found herself standing outside the Carter estate, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't set foot on the property since the night she walked away, and now, as she stood in front of the towering iron gates, she felt like a stranger in a place that had once been her home. She took a deep breath before pressing the intercom button. A moment later, the voice of the family's longtime butler, Thomas, came through the speaker. "Miss Carter?" Alyssa swallowed. "I'd like to see my father." There was a pause, then the gates slowly began to open. Walking up the long driveway, memories flooded her mind, childhood summers spent running through the gardens, extravagant holiday parties filled with people she barely knew, quiet moments when she had once believed this house was a place of warmth, not just power. When she stepped inside, she found her father in his study, just as he had been the last time she saw him. He was seated behind his massive desk, a glass of whiskey in hand, his expression unreadable as he looked up at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Richard set his glass down. "I didn't think I'd see you again." Alyssa crossed her arms. "I didn't think I'd come back." Her father leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "So why are you here?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "I needed to say something. And I needed you to hear it." Richard gestured for her to continue, his expression unreadable. Alyssa took a deep breath. "You tried to break me. You tried to make me believe that I was nothing without your money, your approval, your influence. But I'm still here. And I'm happy. I built a life for myself, without you. And I don't regret a single choice I made." Richard exhaled slowly, running a hand over his jaw. "So, you came all this way just to tell me you don't need me?" Alyssa shook her head. "No. I came to tell you that despite everything, I don't hate you. You may never accept my choices, but I refuse to let your disapproval define me anymore." For the first time, something in Richard's expression shifted. There was no anger, no disappointment, just something almost unreadable, something close to regret. He didn't apologize. He didn't admit that he was wrong. But he also didn't try to convince her that she had failed. Instead, after a long moment, he simply said, "You've changed." Alyssa lifted her chin. "I had to." Richard was silent for a long time before nodding once. "Then I suppose there's nothing left to say." Alyssa exhaled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "No. There isn't." She turned and walked away, knowing that this time, she was leaving on her own terms. Alyssa left her father's estate feeling a strange sense of relief mixed with an undeniable sadness. She had gone there without expecting an apology, without hoping for some grand reconciliation, but part of her had still wished for something more. Instead, she had gotten what she had always known to be true: Richard Carter was incapable of admitting fault and capable of bending to anything he couldn't control. As she drove back to her apartment, her mind replayed the conversation over and over again. She had said everything she needed to say, yet she still felt the weight of his words lingering in her chest. Her father had acknowledged that she had changed, but it wasn't approval, nor was it regret. It was simply a statement of fact, as if he had finally recognized that she was no longer the obedient daughter he had once shaped her to be. When she walked through the door, James was waiting for her. He had been sitting on the couch, his eyes scanning a medical journal, but the moment she stepped inside, he set it down and studied her carefully. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with concern. Alyssa set her keys on the counter and let out a slow breath. "It went exactly as I expected. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask me to come back. But he also didn't try to convince me that I had made a mistake." James nodded, waiting for her to continue. She hesitated before sinking down onto the couch beside him. "It's strange. I should feel closure, but I don't know if I do." James reached for her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "Maybe closure doesn't always come in the way we expect it to. Maybe it's just realizing that you don't need his approval anymore." Alyssa exhaled, leaning into his touch. "I think I knew that before I even walked in there. But there was still a part of me that wanted him to see me, really see me, for the person I am now." James squeezed her hand. "And do you think he did?" She thought about it for a moment. "Maybe. But it doesn't change anything." James studied her, then leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "You don't need him to change for you to move forward." Alyssa nodded, feeling the truth in his words. Her father would never be the man she had once wished him to be. He would never give her the kind of unconditional love she had spent so many years searching for. But she had found love elsewhere, in James, in the life she was building, in the woman she was becoming. That night, as they lay in bed, James wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Are you happy?" he murmured into the darkness. Alyssa didn't answer right away. She let the question settle, let herself really think about it. Her life wasn't perfect. She had lost things that once felt irreplaceable. She had fought battles that had left scars. But in this moment, lying beside the man she loved, knowing she had chosen this path for herself, she realized that happiness wasn't about perfection. It was about freedom. She tilted her head up to look at him. "Yeah," she whispered. "I really am." James smiled, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Good." And for the first time in her life, Alyssa felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Alyssa woke up to the soft glow of the morning sun streaming through the curtains. The warmth of James's arms around her was comforting, a silent reminder that she had chosen this life, this love, and this path for herself. For the first time in months, she didn't wake up with a sense of dread or uncertainty weighing her down. Instead, she felt a quiet kind of peace, a feeling she had spent most of her life chasing without realizing it was always within her reach. James was still asleep beside her, his breathing slow and steady. She turned onto her side, watching him for a moment, marveling at how different her life had become since the day she met him. She had gone from being the daughter of a billionaire, expected to follow a path paved for her, to a woman who had taken control of her own destiny. She had lost security, lost the privilege she had once taken for granted, but she had gained something far more valuable: independence, self-worth, and a love that was real, not transactional. She slipped out of bed quietly, wrapping herself in a sweater as she padded into the kitchen. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, she found herself thinking about her father again. It was strange, she had spent so long craving his approval, believing that she needed it to feel whole. But after their last conversation, she realized that she didn't need anything from him anymore. She had stood in front of him as her own person, and he had seen it. Whether he accepted it or not no longer mattered. James walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he reached for his own cup of coffee. He gave her a sleepy smile before leaning in and pressing a kiss to her cheek. "You're up early," he murmured. Alyssa shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." He studied her for a moment. "Thinking about him?" She nodded, not needing to clarify who him was. "A little. But not in the same way as before." James took a sip of his coffee before setting the cup down on the counter. "And how do you feel now?" Alyssa exhaled slowly. "Like I'm finally free." James reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You always were, Alyssa. You just had to see it for yourself." She smiled, leaning into him. "I think I finally do." Over the next few weeks, life settled into a new normal. Alyssa continued to work at the marketing firm, steadily climbing her way up through hard work and determination. She no longer carried the weight of trying to prove something to her father or to anyone else. Instead, she focused on proving something to herself, that she was capable, strong, and worthy of the life she was building. One afternoon, as she was leaving work, she received an unexpected call. She glanced at her phone, her heartbeat quickening when she saw her mother's name flashing on the screen. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Mom?" Sarah's voice was soft, hesitant. "Hi, sweetheart. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." Alyssa shook her head, even though her mother couldn't see her. "No, it's fine." "What's going on?" There was a pause before Sarah spoke again. "Your father's been asking about you." Alyssa's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "What does he want?" Sarah sighed. "I don't know. He doesn't say much, but I can tell that he misses you. He won't admit it, but I know him, Alyssa. He's been different since you left." Alyssa bit her lip, unsure of how to respond. Part of her wanted to brush it off, to say that he had made his choice just as she had made hers. But another part of her, the part that still carried pieces of the little girl who had once idolized her father, felt something close to hope. "I'm not ready," she admitted. "I don't know if I ever will be." Sarah's voice was gentle. "That's okay. Just know that the door isn't closed forever." Alyssa nodded, even though she wasn't sure what the future held. Maybe one day, her father would truly see her for who she was and not just for who he had wanted her to be. Maybe he never would. But either way, she knew she would be okay. That evening, she told James about the conversation as they cooked dinner together. He listened without interrupting, letting her process her emotions out loud. When she finished, he simply wrapped his arms around her and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said softly. "Just take it one step at a time." Alyssa smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I think that's the first time in my life I've ever done that." James chuckled. "Then it's about time." As they sat down for dinner, Alyssa looked around at the life she had built, not the one that had been handed to her, but the one she had chosen. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't wrapped in luxury, and it didn't come with the same guarantees she had once known. But it was real, it was hers, and for the first time in her life, that was more than enough. She reached for James's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze as she looked into his eyes. "I love you," she said softly. James smiled, his gaze warm and unwavering. "I love you too." And in that moment, Alyssa knew that no matter what happened next, she had already won. The ending of this story is not just about love conquering obstacles, but about personal growth, breaking free from generational expectations, and redefining what truly matters in life. Alyssa's journey is one of self-discovery, proving that happiness doesn't come from wealth, status, or approval. It comes from choosing a path that aligns with one's own values and desires. Her father, Richard Carter, represents the rigid traditions and societal norms that many people feel trapped by. His resistance to the marriage was never really about James, it was about control, legacy, and the fear of change. But Alyssa's strength in standing her ground forced him to confront something deeper, the realization that his daughter was no longer the obedient girl he had once molded but a strong, independent woman capable of making her own choices. What makes the conclusion powerful is that it doesn't rely on forced reconciliation or unrealistic redemption. Richard doesn't suddenly become a different person overnight. Instead, there is a subtle acknowledgement that he sees Alyssa for who she truly is, even if he can't fully accept it yet. This leaves the door open for future healing, but it also reinforces the idea that Alyssa doesn't need his validation to be whole. James's role in this story is just as important. He is not the rescuer of Alyssa, nor is he the reason for her transformation. Instead, he is her partner, someone who supports her, challenges her to think beyond her father's influence, and loves her for who she is, not for where she comes from. Their love is not about defying expectations for the sake of rebellion but about building something real together. Ultimately, this is a story of liberation. It's about learning that true happiness isn't found in the approval of others but in the courage to choose oneself. Alyssa walked away from privilege, from comfort, from everything she had once known, but in doing so, she found something far greater, a life that was truly hers.